So hi everyone, welcome. I feel pretty honored that you all came here to hear me. So thank you for that. I'd like to start out with reading a testimony from this book that we're touring with called Our Harsh Logic. And this is one of the stories, or one of the testimonies in the first chapter, which talks about the idea of prevention. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And this is a testimony from a unit called the Kfir Brigade. And it's a story that took place in a small village outside of Nablus, outside of Shechem. And the place is called Chades. And it's the end of 2009, this story. So the interviewer asks the soldier, during your service in the territories, what shook you up the most? And he answers, the searches we did in Chales. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. They said there are 60 houses that we have to search. I said that there had to be some sort of a warning for the intelligence. I tried to justify it to myself. Was this during the day or the night? At night. You went out as a patrol, as a group of soldiers patrolling the village of Chales? No, the whole division. It was a battalion operation. They spread out over the whole village, took control of the school, smashed the locks, the classrooms. One room was used as an investigation room for the Shin Bet, for the Secret Service. One room for detainees. One room for soldiers to rest. I remember it particularly annoyed me that they chose a school. We went house by house, knocking at 2 a.m. on the family's door. They're scared to death. Girls peeing in their pants with fear. We bang on the doors. There's a feeling of, well, we'll show them. We go into the house and turn everything upside down. What's the procedure? Gather the family in one room, put a guard there, tell the guard to keep the gun in them, and then search the whole house. We received another order to arrest everyone between the ages 16 and 29, doesn't matter who. Bring him cuffed and blindfolded. They yelled at old people. One of them had an epileptic seizure. They carried on yelling at him. He didn't speak Hebrew, and they continued to yell at him. The medic treated him. We did the rounds. Every house we went into, they took everyone between 16 and 29 and brought them to the school. They sat tied up in the schoolyard. Did they tell you the purpose of all this? To locate weapons. But we didn't find any weapons in the end. They confiscated kitchen knives. What shocked me the most was there was also stealing. One person took 20 shekels. People went into houses and looked for things to steal. This was a very poor village. At one point, guys were saying, what a bummer, there's nothing to steal. One guy said, I took markers just so I could say that I stole something. So this is one testimony out of 140 testimonies that we have put together in this book. And these are 140 testimonies out of close to 1,000 individual soldiers that we have met. So we're talking about thousands of testimonies, thousands of stories that we have gathered up until today. What I'll do very quickly is I'll introduce myself, and I'll introduce the organization that I represent, Breaking the Silence. And I'll try to spend most of our time together actually talking about this analysis that we did in this book that we published. Which is actually for us a pretty new step. And I'll get to that in a second, why we think this book is so important, and what made me leave my house and wife for 3.5 weeks and tour the States, and why we feel this is so important to get the message out there. So thank you, Amy, for the introduction, and thank you the Oral History Department, the Middle East Department, for having me and co-sponsoring this event. And again, thank you for all of you for coming. So, like I was introduced, I grew up in Israel, in a religious family, an Orthodox family. I think it's only relevant in this discussion because in the community that I grew up in Israel, it was very clear to me from a very young age that my next step in life after high school is going to the army. My grandmother herself actually fought in 1948 in what Israelis call the War of Independence, Palestinians call the Nakba. She tells a story of running through the streets of Jerusalem with a metal pan on her head to make sure she wouldn't be hit by the ricochets. My dad was a paratrooper that served in 1973, and I'm named after a soldier that was killed in the Yom Kippur War. And when I finished my high school and thinking about my army service, I knew that I'm going to do the best I can to be the best I can be and to get into the most elite army unit that I can. And when I think back of this, the reason I did that was because I cared about my country, about my society, my communities. I believed that I had my right to protect myself. And in that sense, even though this was in 2004 and today we're in 2013, that's exactly the same thing that brings me in front of you today. And in that sense, when I look back at what were the things that motivated me as an 18, 19-year-old to, of course, go into the army, but also a volunteer to be a paratrooper in a special operations unit, was because I cared deeply about my country. And the only way I see that I could continue to do that caring is by today breaking my silence and talking about this reality that I was part of. I started my service after about a year of training, serving mostly around Nablus and Jenin, which are in the northern part of the West Bank. Right over here, this is Nablus, and up here is Jenin. And while serving, and maybe this will surprise a lot of you, maybe this will surprise most of the people sitting here, but the first time that I actually had a real interaction, not only hearing about or maybe sitting on the bus or reading about in the newspaper, and the first time I had a real interaction with a Palestinian was when I started my service. Almost a year into my service, and we were actually ordered to do something called a straw widow, which I'll explain what that means in a second. And we entered a Palestinian home in the middle of the night. That was my first face-to-face interaction with a Palestinian. And the mission that we were ordered to do was something that I know there's some Israelis here in the crowd. Maybe some of them know the term straw widow or almanat kash in Hebrew. But I think even if I would have a similar crowd in Israel, most people today do not know what straw widow actually means. Right? So in that sense, this breaking of silence is something that is definitely, and we spend most of our efforts there, by the way, should happen also inside the Israeli society. And this mission of the straw widow is basically taking over a house for military purposes. Meaning I want to use the window, right? I want to look over a junction, a road, a village center. You go into the house in the middle of the night, take the entire family, lock them in one room. If they want to use the bathroom, they want to use the kitchen, they need permission from you. And that was my first ever interaction with Palestinian basically. And that was one incident throughout dozens and dozens of straw widows, of arrests, of checkpoints, checkposts, and basically what you could imagine, controlling a population looks like. And throughout my service, I think one of the strongest things that I felt, which eventually, if you'd like, pushed me to breaking the silence, is something that today when I speak with my friends in the organization, we all felt. And there's this very strong feeling when you're in the West Bank, when you're serving, that this whole idea of right and wrong, good or bad, that in our day-to-day life we're sure we know how to differentiate so easily, suddenly for 3 years this is all put in the blender and it turns into mush. And in my unit alone there were, and I read this testimony from 2009, but similar things happened in my unit. I mean, this isn't, the story from that I read is definitely not a unique story. It's something that happened at the beginning of the Second Intifada in 2000, something that happens, if you'd like, in our latest testimonies in the last year or so. And in my service, I somehow found a way to constantly justifying this entire reality to myself. And I still today try to explain to myself how I did it. And I still don't know if I have a good answer, but one of the things that, in that sense, managed to burst this bubble was towards the end of my service, I went home on a weekend, and someone who already finished the army gave me this black booklet. It said on it, Breaking the Silence, Hebron, 2004, 2006. And I look at it, and I asked him, what is it? And he says, read it. On the way into the base, back to Nablus, I read through these testimonies, and I read that these are soldiers that did not serve in my same unit, did not serve in the same place, but their stories are unbelievably similar to what I experienced. And that was a very important moment for me, a politicizing moment for me. Because throughout my service I thought, well, there's a few isolated incidences. Right? There's a few, so there's this one guy in my unit who we call the Tasmanian Devil, and he used to go into the house, and the house never looked the same, and there was the one guy that used to slap Palestinians on the head all the way, when they were arrested, all the way to the base. But these are, but that's not all of us, and it's only them. And when I read through these testimonies, I understood two things. First of all, this is a much bigger picture, if you like, maybe a story of a generation. And I think the second thing I understood, and this was much more important for me, is for a second, that was really like this crystallizing moment where I understood the problem are not in what people tend to call these isolated incidences or these rotten apples, right? They're not isolated, they happen in every unit, read through our testimonies. But much more important than focusing on the rotten apples is let's understand the rotten baskets. And in that, one of the things that we say, which is very important for us to say, I have personal responsibility. We have personal responsibility. Maybe that's what's bringing me in front of you today. But in order to change this reality of this long-lasting control over millions of people, it has to be, first of all, a political solution. We have to understand we do not have to change the army, but we have to change the system. Right? In that sense, end occupation or end this control, an army control over civilians. And this testimonial book put me on this personal journey where I tried to find some answers. I was told in my high school, in my yeshiva, my religious high school, that a good Jew walks around with question marks around his head. And I had a lot of questions. And with those questions, I was searching for some answers, and I eventually found myself on a tour with Breaking the Silence of the South Hebron Hills, going to a Palestinian village called Susia. I'm standing in Susia inside this Palestinian village, and the other side of the hill, like in the Dr. Seuss story, in the other side of the hill, there's a settlement of Susia. And I remember that a year and a half earlier, I was a soldier guarding Susia. And that gave me a lesson in perspectives. Eventually, I went on more tours, talked to more people, eventually decided to give a testimony myself to Breaking the Silence. And I've been involved in the organization for 4 years now. I do most of our work in North America and with the work in Israel with the Jewish communities, the non-Israeli Jewish communities, people in gap year, rabbinical students, and so on. I have to say that these 4 years have been extremely interesting. not necessarily easy, but in my perspective, this is the only way I know how to deal with this reality, by speaking out and picking up a mirror to the society that sent me there. Breaking the silence started in July 2004. So I started from 2004 and 2007. The guys that started the organization were actually enlisted about 3 years before me. And they served in Hebron during the peak of the Second Intifada. The interesting thing about this group, unlike me and most of our testifiers today, they came together as 60 soldiers who all served together in the Nachal Brigade, the 50th Nachal Brigade in Hebron, and all of them came together and said, let's talk about this. Let's open this up and let our societies, our communities, our families, our friends, our youth movements understand what they're actually asking us to do there. Right? And start this discussion, which is so important, and in our perspective, lacking in this discourse. What are our moral values? What are our moral boundaries? And what they decided to do is put together an exhibition of photos of themselves in different positions, of themselves, of Palestinians, and this is basically pictures that they took. All the exhibition were photos that soldiers took of a reality that they were part of, and underneath each and every picture, they told a story. They told a story, they tried to bridge this gap or break the silence. They were blown away with the amount of interest. In 2 weeks alone, there were close to 10,000 people that came to see them, see this exhibition. They were also invited to come and present their stories in the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset, which is probably today, in our political reality today, probably isn't going to happen. But in that sense, besides this act of breaking their silence that they did with the exhibition, two very important things happened. I think the most important things that could have happened to the organization. The first thing is that they realized with the amount of interest that there's something here that's bigger than them. And this pushed them to say, well, it's not only about this photo exhibition, but let's form an organization. And the second thing that happened, which I think is very interesting, is soldiers came to see this exhibition on their weekend out of the army. And they didn't serve with them in Hebron. They didn't serve in their same unit. But a lot of them came out and said, you don't understand what's the big deal. We also do this. It's also what we do in Nablus or in Ramallah, and we're in different brigades, and we have different stories that you tell in the different brigades. But we also do this, and that's when they realized that this, like I said, is a much wider story, and not only the 50th Nachal Battalion in Hebron, but this wider story that has to do with every soldier serving in the West Bank. Originally, it really started with combat male soldiers, and the picture of the soldier, like the picture of the soldier on our book, right, with a helmet. But very quickly, female soldiers came as well, and they said some of us were in combat positions, some of us served in different positions in the West Bank, and we have something to give and something to say. And eventually, breaking the silence, like I said, today has met close to 1,000 soldiers, and we have published 10 publications throughout the years, which try to bridge this gap of knowledge and let people know what it means to control people by force. And we gather testimonies from soldiers in the West Bank, and of course East Jerusalem is part of the West Bank, and Gaza. Our publications have been, till now, around specific areas, geographical areas, have been sometimes a specific group. So for example, you can find us on our website. We published a booklet of female testimonies. I think one of the most important publications, and probably the most controversial one was around Operation Cast Lead. And in that sense, we tried as much as we can. It's not an easy, and we're in the, in the oral history department. It's not easy to document and publish. It's it's not it's not something that you can do from today to tomorrow. But in that sense, we try to get information as quickly as we can out there and start this discussion. What we do in the organization is maybe the heart of our work is gathering these testimonies. The second part of our work is educational work. With these testimonies, we'll take people to the ground, to Hebron, to South Hebron Hills. We'll give lectures to who's ever interested. We spend most of our efforts in the Israeli society. 60% of our work is in Israel with Israelis. 20%, that's pretty much what I do, is with the non-Israeli Jewish crowd. But one of the things we get heavily criticized for is the fact that we don't only speak with Israelis, don't only speak with Jews. And in that sense, what we're doing now could be criticized. And one of the things, and by the way, we don't take this lightly, even though in our time and age where everything is open, everything is out there, we don't take this lightly. We understand that this is an issue and a topic that should be addressed, but in that sense, we feel that it's much more dangerous to keep these things quiet. And I understand that that's a point to debate, and if you'll have some questions about that at the end, I'll be happy to address that. And then maybe the third part of our work is, and this is important for us to say, we're not only about this personal catharsis, or we're not only about getting the stories out there, but we are about changing a political reality. And we are here to increase resistance to the occupation, of course in a non-violent way, but we want to do whatever we can. And this is how we can be relevant to the story, till people know. We believe when people hear what's happening on the ground, the vast majority of them will understand that this has to end. And maybe one of the discussions that is always there in this issue, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Israeli occupation, is, okay, well, one state or two state. Well, are you doing this or are you doing that? And in that sense, what we try to do is, before you go into that discussion, which is an important one and has to be done, take a few steps back. And we could be attacked for many different reasons. We could attack for talking out of a country or airing our dirty laundry and whatnot. But one of the things that we're not attacked for is the truth that we're putting out there. And in that sense, I don't think that that there's anything new in these stories, right? I mean, there's if you listen to Palestinian stories, this has been coming up for years. I think what we can say very clearly is, look who's telling this now, right? And in that sense, what we can hope to do is change a political reality. We will get this information out there to whoever is relevant to change. So that's a quick introduction of me and Breaking the Silence. Let's try to talk a little bit about this book and this publication, and you'll tell me how I am with timing, because I can usually go on and on. Okay. After about 7 years of gathering testimonies, but we actually started gathering stories from soldiers in the peak of the soldiers in the beginning of the second Intifada from September 2000. In end of 2009, we said, we have this body of stories, right? We have dozens and dozens of testimonies. And we thought maybe it's about time that we do a little bit of analysis. Right? Not only talk about, look, this is what occupation looks like, right? This is the pride that it is taken from the Palestinian society and the Palestinian community, right? This is the effect it has on us as individuals, and maybe on our society as well. But let's put this out there very clearly. This is important for me to say. We were not the victims. Okay? Let's put that out there very clearly. We were controlling of a system, right? And in that sense, you can talk about responsibility on both sides, and there's violent actions on each side, but at the end of the day, this is a system that's built by Israel for Israel, right? And there's no dispute there. And when we started thinking about doing a little bit of analysis to this reality, we came together as an organization and we started working on this book that we published. But before I say what is in the book, I think it's very important to say what's not in the book. Right? There's a lot of things that are not in the book, a lot of testimonies that we don't have, right? We don't gather testimonies from Palestinians. We don't gather testimonies from Israelis or Israeli settlers. We don't gather testimonies from government officials, right? Or from high-ranking officers, not generals and so on. We do have some pretty high-ranking officers who gave us testimonies, who spent a fair amount of time in their army service, but definitely not the generals. And we don't have testimonies of the Secret Service. What we do have is a story which I think is relevant to anyone. It doesn't really matter how you think this should change, how you think what your political outcome should be. This is relevant to you. Because what we can talk about is what the actions or what the orders from up high looked like on the ground. And when we started working, putting this analysis together, I think one of the things that we constantly hear and constantly comes up is that basically what we're doing maybe looks bad, maybe is this and that, but in the end of the day, it's for defense, right? Israel's protection, Israel's security. And I have to say that this is definitely part of the story, right? Maybe a distorted idea of security, and we'll try to break that down a little bit. But actually, most of what we're spending our efforts in, right, on the ground, is actually an offensive act, right? And what I'll try to do now is break that down a little bit. And what we really did with this book is we took 4 terms or 4 words that are known to, I would say, every soldier for sure, but for the vast majority of Israelis as well, and don't necessarily have a negative connotation to them as well. And I'll try to explain that. We took these 4 terms as we see them, maybe the 4 pillars of occupation. What is allowing this reality to sustain itself, to maintain itself? And broke those 4 words down. And what we try to do in the book is, if you like, translate them. Right? Talk about what these terms actually look like today on the ground. Now, I'll start with the first chapter of the book, and this is also the longest chapter, and I'll spend the most amount of time talking about it, but I'll also try to refer to the other 3 chapters. The first chapter of the book is a term called prevention. Right? In Hebrew, the term prevention is called sikul. And maybe we'll have a quiz. When the Israelis hear sikul, what comes to mind? Memukad. Sikul memukad. Right? Sikul memukad. Right? Targeted prevention. That's what it means literally. Right? Targeted prevention. What it basically means is assassinations, right? We have and this is the scenario that is always brought up, a ticking bomb scenario. Right? The Palestinian was on his way to kill Israeli citizens or Israeli soldiers, and he could be sometimes strapped with an explosive belt or with a gun, and he's on his way to commit this act. What we have to do is to stop him before he gets there, right? And we can have a discussion, which I think is an interesting one, of the limits of power and what can you execute without a trial and so on and so forth. But besides that being an interesting discussion, that's where most people, when they hear the word prevention, that's where it stays, right? We're going to do these targeted preventions to stop someone who is out there to kill us, and there's a Jewish order in the Bible, he that will rise to kill you, you shall kill him first. But the interesting thing about this reality is that this is a very specific situation. If you like, a tip in this reality. And imagine a triangle for a second. In the tip of the triangle, you actually have these realities of a ticking bomb. But they don't happen every day, right? Actually, something that happens in comparison to what we're talking about pretty rarely. But what we can talk about today is what prevention turned into. And if you look at this as a triangle, right after this idea of targeted prevention, right, assassinating people that are taking bombs, we know today that Israel also assassinated people that weren't specifically taking bombs. We wanted to get our hands on them. It wasn't easy for us to arrest them, so we dropped half a ton of bomb at their house. Right? Or we shot them sometimes from 900, 800 meters away. Right? I was a sergeant of a sniper's team. Those were missions that my soldiers did with me leading. But when we continue on in this triangle, if you'd like, we can continue on with different ways that Palestinians were killed. We can talk about specific times in the past decade where Palestinians in big cities, IDF is driving through the city. If you see a Palestinian with a binocular, you can get the orders to kill. Or standing with a cell phone, or standing on a rooftop, right? This varies in that sense, right? What is a ticking bomb and when do you shoot and kill? But I think the widest sense of this, and this will surprise maybe most of you, is revenge killings. We know of at least a dozen revenge killings that took place by the IDF. One of the most famous ones is when 6 Israeli soldiers were killed in a checkpoint near Ramallah called En Arik. The next night, 3 different units were sent to 3 different places, one in Ramallah, one in Nablus, and one in Gaza, which there's a whole Israel in between. And they were sent there, given orders. Anyone standing in a specific checkpoint at a certain time at night, you shoot to kill. And in the night, 15 Palestinian policemen were found dead. We have testimonies from soldiers in this mission, from officers, from sergeants. There was a big piece you can Google in Ma'ariv, which used to be a very big Israeli newspaper. Don't know if it will survive the next couple of years. But you Google Ein Arik, this comes up, and this story was published, and of course, it's people who are involved in these issues, this isn't news. And in that sense, we take this specific idea of prevention and make it wider and wider and wider. We don't even only have to stay in the specific idea of sikulim, of targeted prevention. We can talk about arrests, right? Something that happened much more commonly, right? So you think of who you can arrest or who you'll arrest in this reality. So you think of people who are involved in terrorist organizations that are trying to attack Israelis and whatnot. And that's really this tip scenario. But we also can talk about going out and arrest someone. He's not there, you arrest his brother. Or he's not there, you arrest his cousin. Right? And in that sense, again, we can continue on and on. But one of the, we read a part about this in Chares, but we know about many, many stories where you go out and arrest everyone in the village between 18 and 29 or 39. And I think one of the most interesting, or the peaks of this idea of prevention, right? The most interesting example of this idea of prevention is a type of mission that I got many times, and of course soldiers all over the West Bank hear and carry out, are orders to have your presence felt. Right? And the idea of having your presence felt is we will be in every place, in every time, in any second. Right? When we're sitting here in Hebron, which is a city we know very, very well, there are now 2 patrols in the city, 30 and 39. Right? And they're patrolling around the city, and their orders are to have your presence felt. Right? Boogie Elon was now was Minister of Defense, used to be Chief of Staff. He coined the phrase to brand the Palestinian consciousness. Right? Tzrivat toda'ah. And in that sense, the way it looks on the ground could have many different ways of the way it looks. We were ordered to go into the town and show that there's a new sheriff, right? You can shoot lampposts, sometimes you can shoot water tanks. Right? In Hebron, you enter houses. Right? So you randomly enter a house, women to the right, men to the left, search through the house, 3, 4 in the morning, or it could be a couple houses. It depends on how much energy you have or how much time you have. And in that sense, any Palestinian in Hebron, or in Ramallah, or in Bethlehem, or basically all over the West Bank, constantly has to feel that there's an Israeli soldier right here. And you know, we don't see ourselves as a human rights organization per se. And in that sense, we differentiate between working in conflict or working on conflict. We're trying to work on conflict and change this reality, which is a political reality. But if we'll take the terminology from the human rights for a second, what this actually means is collective punishment. Right? What this basically means is it doesn't matter how you want to live your life as a Palestinian, there's nothing you can do that will get you away from this reality. Right? When I think, and just, you know, for instance, when I think of my future, and I see my future in Israel, right, and I see my, you know, starting a family in Israel, and I think of the fact that my neighbor, doesn't matter what he does or how he will live his life, right, and if he decides to be, you know, live his life like Mahatma Gandhi, there's still nothing he can do to get away from this. And I think one of the most interesting testimonies that we have gotten, and it's actually more recent even, not ancient history, right? 2000 in the Middle Eastern times is in ancient history. Recent testimonies, which have had publications, not only in our testimonies, but in media and in newspapers and television, operations called mock arrests. Mock arrests, where the orders of the soldiers are actually entering the house to train. Right? There's mock arrests, there's mock straw windows. You go into the house, take the head of the family, tie his eyes, his hand, drive 5-6 kilometers, and this finds his way back. I took part in a mission like this. Wasn't a mock arrest, it was a mock straw widow, fake straw widow. But I for a lot of time thought that it's horrible and we're training on people and ta. But the more interesting part, the more interesting aspect of that is, I would say, that's one aspect of it, training the soldiers. The better aspect, or what is much more beneficial in that sense, is it's helping us to have our presence felt. Right? I mean, imagine what this does to a community or a society when you're taking someone who had no connection to any organization, that had nothing, no prior history, and you take him, right? What confusion that causes, right? I'm not talking about the psychological aspects and what it does the family and whatnot. And in that sense, when we talk about prevention, and this is what under each chapter we also, we if you like, we gave the short translation of what prevention means, and we talk about prevention being intimidating the Palestinian population, and we see today this idea of prevention as in order for us to feel secure. What we basically have to do is control Palestinians. The second chapter of the book is talks about separation. Again, separation, when you think about separation, and don't know what most of you think, but at least on the table today, most people are talking about separation, right? The two-state solution is a form of separation. But the interesting thing is that even though most of us think that the separation, the future separation, or the current separation with the wall or the barrier or whatnot is there to separate Israelis from Palestinians, that's part of it, but it's actually a small part of what we're doing. We're spending most of our efforts separating Palestinians from Palestinians. Right? We're separating Palestinians outside of the West Bank and Gaza, right? We're separating Palestinians from in Israel and the West Bank as well, right? We're separating Palestinians from Gaza and from the West Bank. But even if you only look specifically inside the West Bank is divided into 5 different regions, right? And it depends when in the past decade, but Palestinians driving from north to south have to actually cross through different regions, right? So you can be a carpenter from Hebron, from Khalil, that wants to take your merchandise up to Nablus, and you can make it half the way, but then you won't be able to cross because you don't have a permit to that specific area or that specific zone. But even in cities, for example, Hebron, the city is divided, is separated. Right? Originally by an agreement that was signed both by the Israelis and Palestinians, but I encourage you guys, and I'll say this again, go up on our website and see a short video about Hebron, and you'll realize our responsibility in that. Of course, we also separate Palestinians from each other, from families, or separate Palestinians from their land. And I think in that sense, and of course, very well known, right? Area A, B, and C, right? We're separating Palestinians dramatically in area A, B, and C, but we won't have time to go into all of that. But what we're actually doing is this idea of divide and conquer. Right? And what kind of Palestinian community or Palestinian leadership can grow in a place like this? Right? I remember we took, I think it's already a year ago, a group of journalists and diplomats and opinion makers down to the South Hebron Hills to see the reality there. And Salam Fayyad, who was back then the Palestinian prime minister, asked to join. And he joined and he talked and he was part of what was happening there. We moved from one Palestinian village to another Palestinian village, a 5-minute ride. He was not allowed to cross because the soldier there, from a body called the Civil Administration, which I'll say a word about in a second, prevented him from crossing. Right? So in that sense, of course, Palestinians in Susia see themselves as Palestinians, right? Maybe would like to be represented by Salam Fayyad, but he has no authority over them, and he has no responsibility in that sense. And I think this idea of separation is an unbelievable tool, right? Which is allowing this reality to maintain or to stay in such a way. The third chapter, I'll say a word about separation, specifically in Area C, I think is very interesting. Those of you that are following what is happening in the region, I think what we see pretty clearly is this quiet, if you'd like, annexation of Area C. And of course, this idea of separation helps us out very, very much, right? Because when a Palestinian is not getting permits to build, not getting permits to connect to water and electricity, then eventually he will leave, it will move over slowly to Israel, but that's maybe a different lecture. The third chapter, this idea of fabric of life. Again, what's wrong with fabric of life? Right? Israel is allowing the Palestinians to maintain their fabric of life. And in that sense, one of the most interesting testimonies in the book is a testimony from soldiers from the civil administration. Right? The civil administration is a body that works today underneath the Ministry of Defense. There are also soldiers there, but also civilians. I would say not a small amount of the civilians are many times settlers as well, who work in this body which administrates Palestinian life. And they control what is happening in the West Bank in different levels, right? Much more in area C, less so in area B, and less so in area A. But in that sense, there's no question about our control over the West Bank. A friend of mine in his reserve duty a year and a half ago went parading between the two mountains of Nablus in the heart of the city. Right? There was no reason to do it, but they could do it. Right? And this idea of fabric of life is something we have to understand. We're allowing the Palestinians to maintain their fabric of life. We can always take it back. And that's basically what control means. Right? I mean, in that sense, it's not about making the situation look better. It's about changing this reality where we have the power to control millions of people. And I think that in that sense, it's always in the grace of the occupier, right? It's always in our decision to give a permit or not to give a permit, right? And if we'll give permits, for example, to move from place to place, or even to work in Israel, right? People who are going to work in Israel, right? Then we'll pat ourselves on the back and say, look how nice we are as occupiers. The last chapter, and then I'll try to close this up and maybe leave some time for a discussion, and I'm sure you have some questions and thoughts and ideas about what we've been talking about, is this idea of law enforcement. This idea of law enforcement, again, what's wrong with law enforcement? In order to understand this idea of law enforcement, what we talk about in law enforcement, we talk about this idea of a dual regime. And for the first time ever, one of the things that we haven't been talking about in the last I don't know, half hour now, which is something that is on the mind of everyone dealing with this reality, is settlements and settlers. And I think this isn't by chance. First of all, it's important for us to put on the table settlers or settlements are part of this reality. Right? Many times they're referred to as the biggest obstacle for peace. And I think in that sense, they're much more of an indication that in this time and age, we are not interested in changing the reality or ending occupation. When we talk about this idea of law enforcement, for the first time the settlements come into the picture, and I think the interesting thing that comes up from the testimonies is that today settlers and settlements are actually seen as an integral part of this idea of security. And I'll try to explain this, and this is for me one of the most important things we can try to talk about. And I think this is also something that when I speak to my Israeli friends, and of course my friends back home, even the guys that served with me, this is something that is not always clear, right? Especially today when the green line is de facto being erased, right? And for sure for Israelis, it's for sure not difficult to cross the green line. And growing up in the religious Zionist community, which is maybe the community that is the backbone of the settlement movement, and I have an uncle who lives in the settlement and a cousin that lived in the little outpost, and a lot of my friends from high school live in settlements. They don't understand what's the problem. I mean, what's the difference between living here and living there? And I think one of the important things that we can try to understand in this reality, and for a second we'll put the soldiers' testimonies aside, let's talk only about the law. Right? Let's talk about this reality that we're living in today has nothing to do with an individual soldier's decision. And in that sense, the interesting thing we have to understand is that in the West Bank, there's two populations that are living side by side, but they're living under a totally different set of rules. Right? Palestinians are living under martial law, under army control, and Israelis are living under Israeli civilian law. Right? And this comes, of course, there's many examples where this will differ, but let's take an example that will, of course, be emotional and will maybe it will also help you remember children. What happens if you have two children? Let's talk about the area of around Ramallah or the South Hebron Hills or in Hebron itself. You have two children that throw stones at you. Right? We're in Hebron, I'm in Hebron 3 times a week. I was stoned both by Israelis and by Palestinians. When they throw a stone at you, the question is, and let's say they're over 12, because that's the age that under the law, right, you're allowed to detain them and arrest them, even though just recently there was a 5-year-old that was detained in Hebron, right? And there's kids between those ages who are also detained and sometimes even arrested, right? But let's talk about, again, the law. When you have two 12-year-olds both throwing stones and they're both caught, what happens to these two children right afterwards? And that's where this dual law comes into play, because if after 12 hours the Israeli child did not see a judge, he has to be sent home. That's the law. I'm a social worker by profession. I'm happy that's the law. And that's I think that that's already too much, but a Palestinian that did the exact same thing goes into an army court, of course, and can be held for 4 times that time. Right? If we're talking about how long an Israeli you could later on pass this out, there's a whole diagram of this, but how long an Israeli child could be held before seeing a lawyer. So we're talking about 2 days. How long a Palestinian can be held before seeing a lawyer? 90. How long can they be held before charges are pressed? 40 if you're Israeli, 160 if you're Palestinian. Eventually, there are no Israeli children in prison, right? There are Palestinian children in prison. So in that sense, the important thing to understand about this dual reality, there's not even a potential for equality. And inside the Israeli society, there's a lot of things that we have to fight with, and there's definitely racism and inequality and whatnot in your community as well, right? But in that sense, at least there's the potential for equality, and you can fight it in courts. You can fight it by demonstrating in the parliament. But in the system, that is not a system which is built by the people for the people, but is by Israel for Israel. Right? This system will always create this reality of inequality. One of the most interesting testimonies that comes up in that sense of how the settlers today have become an integral part of Israel's security is something that I also did. But the testimony of soldiers who come to a settlement could also be what Israel calls illegal settlements, or unauthorized, I think is more accurate, because under international law all settlements are illegal, but Israel reads that differently, of course, and they'll talk about authorized settlements and unauthorized settlements. And in that sense, even when soldiers are sent to unauthorized settlements, the people who will give them the orders, who's allowed in? What are the red and green lines? Meaning, if you pass the red lines, a Palestinian could get shot. Where do you stand is many times a settler himself. What is called a Ravshatz, a regional guarding officer. He's an individual that is protecting the settlement, of course armed, who gets his money from the Ministry of Defense. Right? So in that sense, the settlers today, and I don't know if this has always been the case, but we can definitely talk about this today, have become an integral part of what Israel sees as its security. And when we talk about law enforcement, and maybe you've heard of this term price tag, you have, it's not only settlers actually, but it started out with settlers attacking. There's also Israelis who are not settlers who are getting involved in price tags. Well, they're attacking Palestinians for different reasons. Could be because there was an attack by Palestinians on Israelis, they'll revenge. It could be if an outpost was taken down by the army, they'll attack a Palestinian. It could be because there was a discussion or a law or whatnot, and it's from graffitiing to cutting down olive trees to physically attacking, and worse. It was a case of, and worse. And in that sense, when you think about how this is happening, and there's all these questions in the Israeli side, why aren't we stopping them, and where's law enforcement? How do you enforce law over the law itself? Right? In that sense, we can come out and say very clearly that this idea of law enforcement is funny when you look truly into this reality, because today the settlements and the settlers are definitely seen as an integral part of Israel, an integral part of Israel's security. I want to conclude and then open it up for some Q&A, and I'm sure you have some thoughts about this. In Hebron, in the end of 2008, we have a testimony of a soldier with the orders he got in the pillbox, which is a guarding post, where the orders are written black and white to disrupt the day-to-day life of the Palestinian population. Now, when we talk about this idea of security, right, and all this thing is done, right, all these tools, if you'd like, that I've shown you from the toolbox that we're using, are all justified in the name of security. Is this not security? Maybe it is, but in our sense, a distorted idea of security. This idea of security, like I said, is a zero-sum game. It's either us or them. And in that sense, we will only feel that our security is maintained when we will control Palestinians. I think one of the interesting examples of that is really Ramallah, right? And Ramallah during the peak of the Second Intifada, there were tanks in Ramallah. Today, there are much less presence than what there was 10 years ago, and there's a nightlife, and there's coffee shops and whatnot. Go 20 minutes out of Ramallah to a village called Nebi Salach. There was Google Nebi Salach. There's some very interesting things written about this village. 500 people in Nebi Salach. 250 have been arrested. Dozens have been injured. 2 have been killed. We're spending so much energy in stopping this resistance, or this popular resistance. Does anyone think that Nebi Salach is opposing a threat, a security threat to Israel? No. But I think comparing Nebi Salach to Ramallah is most interesting, because today Ramallah is not questioning Israel's security or Israel's control. Nebi Salach is. And that's why we'll always be in the cycle, because we will always see our security as control over Palestinians. And I think that there's nothing really that Palestinians in that sense could do that will change it, right? Because as we know, they're not going to give up the right for freedom and equality. I mean, it's enough to look around the world, and I don't want them to give up their right to freedom and equality, right? So we're always going to be in this cycle. And I'll just finish with this, where here is where we basically can go back to breaking the silence's basic idea. Is we're against control over a civilian population. And what we're doing today, what Israel is spending most of its efforts doing, is actually entrenching itself in this reality. Now, you can talk about different conflicts around the world. And there are different conflicts around the world. I wasn't in a Syrian army or a Darfurian army. I was an Israeli soldier, and that's what's, or the American army or the Russian army in that sense. And one of the things we say, and I think is extremely true, is silence is not an Israeli epidemic. And look in conflicts around the world, this is something that we see over and over again. But what we can also say is this is a unique reality, and we want to change it, of course, for our benefit, and hopefully you'll agree and help us with that. But we're in this reality where, unlike in other areas in conflict, and let's talk specifically about the U.S. efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, you can criticize them and talk about them, and I can criticize them. But and even if they're only saying they're trying to win hearts and minds, and maybe it's not working, no one is thinking that the Americans are there to stay. Right? Eventually, the question is, when are the troops going to come back? When we're talking about this reality in Israel, which is different, they're on the other side of, they're 5 minutes away, 38 kilometers from Jerusalem is Hebron. That is different. But what we have to understand is extremely relevant, is we're doing whatever we can to keep the status quo. And the only thing I could hope that you will agree upon with me after hearing this is we can debate about the solution. It should be a one-state or a two-state, and in breaking the silence, there's people that have different opinions about what the solution should be, and there's people that are taking different stands on their actions, right? But what we can come out and say is, this is something you have to recognize. And the most dangerous thing for me, and the most horrible thing we can continue to do with the Palestinians, is keeping the status quo. And in that sense, for Israelis, there's either an intifada or quiet. There are Israelis living in the south of Israel that were petrified, living day to day under attacks of rockets, but they're a minority inside Israel. Most Israelis, in that sense, they say, if it's not broken, why fix it? There's no reason to change it. Of course, Palestinians don't have the chance to ignore this occupation. And I think I'll just end with this idea that there's a difference, which is very important for us to put out there, between talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which didn't start in '67, right? Started much before that, and talking about the conflict that has two sides, and responsibilities and talking about an occupation. And the occupation is part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think in that sense, in order to truly try to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we have to start with ending occupation, or wanting to end occupation. How will we do it? Okay, we'll sit in the room and negotiate it. But we want to end occupation. And in that sense, what we can hope to give to this discussion, or to push there into that room, is no matter how we turn this, right, we have to maintain Israel's security, right? There's this, a lot of American politicians referring to Israel talk about the secure Israel and the viable Palestine, right? You heard that. But Israel has its right for security, but let's start talking about secure Israel and the secure Palestine. Right? Let's talk about, one of my close friends from Hebron, Issa Amro, was an incredible person. He said something which is straight to the heart. He said, security is a mutual concept. And in that sense, it's in my interest, like I think it is in the Palestinians' interest, to keep me safe, and it's in my interest to keep them safe. But that will only happen when we will be willing to end this control over Palestinians. I'm an optimist because this is what I choose to do, and I believe that there is an end to this, and we can push things in the right direction. But between optimism and pessimism, there's realism. And one of the phrases that I was taught in my religious high school is "Am hanetzach lo mefached miderech aruka." The eternal people, referring to the Jews, are not afraid of a long journey. And there's a long journey ahead of us for both sides, but the only way we will be able to start understanding this is from a very basic prism, which you all understand. Most people in the United States understand. Most people around the world, I also think most people in Israel understand it, but they're not willing to take a stand there, is everyone deserves freedom and equality. And this can't be something we're spending so much of our efforts maintaining. So I want to leave some time for Q&A. And do you want to, let's go into that?
Yeah, you can take questions as you like. And after the question and answer, Avner will have books for sale and donation box out. I'm just going to pass around a sign-up sheet for people who want to hear about future oral history events too.
Excellent. And there's also a sign-up sheet right behind you guys over there. If you could help pass that around.
And thank you very much for the presentation.
So let's start with questions. I'll write them down and try to answer a few at a time. Can you pass around the sign-up sheet going around? There's like a board there. Yeah, great. If someone could lend me a pen to sign up that sheet. It's very important for us to get the emails. It's a way for us to get this story out there, to stay in touch with you. I promise you, we won't spam your mail. I tend to not sign things usually. But it could really help us if you could do that, especially the people that have to leave in the middle. So let's start with questions. Yeah. What's your name? Just so I'll remember. Tiona.
Okay, so you talked a lot about optimism, and I guess right at the end talked about realism a little bit. And I guess I just wanted to know your opinion. Do you think if Israel were to end the occupation that there would be a third intifada? And if you don't, why not?
Okay. What's your name?
Evelyn.
Evelyn.
What have been the efforts to silence you, and have you resisted?
What's your name?
Heather?
Heather.
What is the widow's
Straw widow.
straw widow?
And I'll take one last one. Yeah. What's your name?
Sharona.
Sharona.
So I thought it was really remarkable when you said that the Knesset asked the soldiers that made the slideshows, other pictures, they invited them to present at Knesset. So how do you reconcile that with such as like the 9-year-old girl that was shot 2 days ago in the neck in Israel? There's not an iota of personal responsibility or reflection, whereas where the Israeli army may not do 100% personal reflection, there is some concept of that, but that's how they invited them to speak at Knesset. So how do you reconcile the two?
Okay, so I'll just start with this and then we'll ask you a few questions. So either straw widow is taking over a house for military purposes. You can have different forms of straw widows, but it's basically using a house or using usually the window of the house as a hold, right? So the hold in a city, in a village, and that way you can use the house through the window. You could sometimes have snipers, sometimes have people with binoculars. The people you enter do not know you're coming, right? You could sometimes go get in a house that's empty, but many times there's people living there, right? So that's the reality that straw widows do. In some places, straw widow could be 6 hours, sometimes 12 hours, sometimes it could be for a week. I'm not exactly sure. An almana or straw widow basically means someone who's not necessarily a widower, but I think also in English, but in Hebrew at least, a straw widow is a widower who doesn't know if her husband's dead or alive. I don't think that this was necessarily how they started using it, but they started talking about almanot as stakeouts and then using this idea of a straw widow. So I heard some different ideas about it, but they started using it in the south of Lebanon. In the south of Lebanon, in many places, it was in the outskirts, a lot of the houses were empty. When moving during the Second Intifada, we're leaving southern Lebanon and spending most of the efforts in the West Bank, in what Israel refers to as the limited conflict. Suddenly, the IDF was looking, okay, we have to be in the heart of the cities, let's do straw widows, and of course there's people living there. So Evelyn and Sharona, I think that your two questions are connected. So Evelyn asked, are people trying to maybe keep our silence or quiet us down?
Yeah.
And Sharona is saying, wait, what silence are you talking about? Right? I mean, first of all, Israelis are known not to keep silent, right? But you were saying, if in the Knesset they heard it, so what silence are we talking about? And is that fair?
I mean, not completely. I wasn't saying that
Yeah.
they're not making sense at all. I just said there's some level of, as opposed to the
Right.
house thing.
Right. So I think in that sense, like I said, this was in 2004 when we started our work. And I think there was the right political atmosphere to allow us in. And I think that in that sense, it is today much more difficult to break your silence than it was back then. And since then, we had, and this will answer you, Evelyn, there were attempts to pass laws. They didn't pass, but there were attempts to pass laws to prevent us from working in many different ways, either prevent our funding, that were orchestrated specifically for a couple of organizations from the left, and we had the privilege to be one of them. And there were also people, parliament members, on the podium of the parliament, holding our material, tearing them, and calling us traitors. So in that sense, it's not that we're in a place where we cannot speak, right? Where we are actually silenced. We work hard to have our voice heard, but let's put things on the table. We're mostly male, not only, but mostly male, Jewish in Israel, right? We were Israeli soldiers. We have the privileges to come out and speak, right? And in that sense, we can do this when a lot of people can't. And the restrictions that we face are nothing in comparison to Palestinian activists.
No, no.
And in that sense, we're not there yet. In that sense, we're fighting for this continuous of our democracy. It's a struggle. We're a minority voice in Israel, but we're not the only ones speaking out against this. So there is a community which hopefully could grow and we feel proud to be part of, that once seeing this reality is opposed to it. It's a minority inside Israeli society. And there are many people that are trying to keep us silent. Many people that are attacking us in many different ways. But we're still in the stage where we can openly break our silence, and hopefully we could continue to do that.
How much is this because you're soldiers? You're speaking to soldiers.
I think that in that sense, one of the reasons that we managed to get, I didn't say this, but we're one of the organizations doing, if you like, alternative education that gets to the most amount of people per year. We take thousands of people on our tours, and we don't preach to the choir. We work very hard to get people who are not convinced in that sense. We managed to meet today the majority of the pre-military academies, which has a different practicality in Israel, but it's kids between high school and the army. We managed to meet most of them. A lot of students, and even every so often, even though that's not our focus, we're not trying to fix the army and make it a more moral army, because we understand that, you can be a moral occupier. We're also sometimes invited by the army itself to speak. Right? It's not what we'll focus our work on, but they'll also recognize our ability to speak. And in Hebron, there's many different groups working. There was just an interview a year ago by the brigadier general that was leaving, and he differentiated between the anarchists and breaking the silence. So in that sense, the anarchists are excellent people working on the ground from different groups that we know very well, but it was easy for him to refer to them as anarchists. And so in that sense, we still have that ability to come out and speak. And we did serve the country for 3 years. We did risk our lives in the name of this. But if we'll see the trend happening, slowly but surely, our voice is also being pushed. We're still there, but these laws and attempts, I think, is a trend. Tion, sorry. I don't know. The question was, is the end of occupation during an intifada? I don't know. There's a Jewish phrase that talks about prophecy was given to the dumb, basically. Like, I don't know. I mean, it's not something that I can say. I don't know what will happen. I would definitely hope that there will not be a violent third intifada in that sense. I think that it's definitely, besides the repercussions of that, which we can try as societies to prevent, there's no question around ending occupation. We have to end occupation. We have to change the system of control, and then we have to make sure that both sides will have their security, right? So in that sense, I do not know, right? But that's a question that we will have to face, because it's not an option to say that, just for this, in this, because like I said, this zero-sum game, either us or them will continue. Okay, so let's take a few more questions. Okay, yes.
Sorry. So, my name is Ari. I'm also from Israel. First, I just wanted to say, it's not a question, but I also served in the paratroopers. I think we're about the same age, probably the same people. And I see a completely different reality than what you see. I think I'm proud of my service, and I think that we basically saved lives of our civilians. And just, I want to invite people to speak with me and with other Israelis here afterwards, because I think that the lecture gives a very narrow perspective of the reality, which is very complex, and you really don't don't get enough of context. So there are a lot of different opinions. What I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned the second Intifada, and I think a lot of the stories of breaking the silence happened after the second Intifada.
During you mean?
During after. I want to point out the second Intifada started after the peace talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians failed. Let's not get into whose fault was that, but they failed. And they launched a violent campaign. I remember it, I lived in Tel Aviv, I was 17 years old. Hundreds of civilians were killed by suicide bombers. By the way, Arabs, Arab Israelis, Jewish, Muslims, everyone.
Thousands is more correct.
Yeah.
Since the second Intifada, there were 1,000
Thousands.
Israelis killed,
Yeah, I didn't want to.
and 6,000 Palestinians.
So my question is, what would you do if you were the Prime Minister of Israel? You have the accountability, and obviously you know a lot about security and everything. People are dying from suicide bombers. How would you stop it?
So, okay, I'll just answer, I think a few questions and then I'll try to get back to that. So first of all, your plan, and then how will I stop suicide bombers? Yeah.
Yeah.
Your name?
So
What's your name?
my name is Amit. I served for 5.5 years in the Israeli military. I was a captain in the special forces. I listened carefully to what you said. I think that, first of all, it's a minority opinion. I think that for every sergeant that will come up with your perspective, I can probably come up with 100 that will have different perspectives.
What's your question?
Just a
This is
second.
a
I'm
question.
getting to that. I listened very carefully to what you said, and I think you just forgot to mention that Israel, IDF, is probably the most humanitarian.
Ask the
It's a
question.
comment and question session.
No, he has to ask the question. It's not his
He
event.
can provide context that he's very captain in the army, and I can give context.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's the most humanitarian military in the world. I spent the last 2 years here in the campus. I'm a Columbia Business School graduate student. I spent the time with captains from the Marines, from the Navy, from the British military, with Palestinian students, with students from other Middle Eastern countries. And we all see what's going on in the Middle East in the last 3 years. And as Ari mentioned, the problem is much more complex, and if anybody wants to stay and talk later on, we're here. Okay.
Amit, thank you. You have a question? No?
Just a
Okay,
remark.
so thank you. Yes,
I have a question about what you...
what's your name?
No, I'm sorry, my name is Laura.
Laura.
And you identified changing the political reality as a major goal and getting it out to whoever is relevant to that change. And my question to you is, who is relevant to that change? Who needs to hear this?
Okay, great. So I'll answer that and we'll do another round of that. So thank you, Ari and Amit, for coming. Thank you for your comment. I think I said, and I stand behind this, where we don't represent, or let's say this differently, like I said before, we're not in the heart of the Israeli consensus. Right? And we definitely do not represent each and every soldier. But I think in both Ari and Amit, that what I would hope that you could appreciate here is, we could talk about what is the political outcome and who's responsible and whatnot. But I think one of the things that is appreciated, not only by people on the left side of the political map, but I encourage you to go see the gatekeepers. You hear the heads of the Secret Service. One of them, Yuval Diskin, was still the head of the Secret Service, echoing exactly what we're talking about. And in that sense, I think that we can have this political discussion of who we represent and what it is we're trying to do and what is our goal. But in that sense, we have close to 1,000 soldiers, right? So you can say that they're all a minority, but they're 1,000 people. And I think they're a tip of the iceberg. And in that sense, it doesn't matter what you think the political reality should be, right? Or how we should change it, or who I should talk to, which is a legitimate discussion, right? Maybe you should think it's legitimate to do it inside Israel with people who know what we're talking about. That's a discussion. But the core issue of what you cannot dispute is the factuality of this. And in that sense, what I would hope that you could get engaged with is, now that you see this is part of the story, this is part of the reality, and maybe you didn't see it in your service, right? But I can promise you, and come to me later and we'll try to do this, give me your unit name and your year, give me a week, I'll send it to someone back home, and we'll find someone from your unit with a testimony. We can do that. Now, I'm not saying this to have this back and forth, but I'm saying there is a reality here that is not about pointing fingers. It's talking about responsibility. And like I said, there's violence on both sides. But at the end of the day, we're controlling this reality. And I think that what we're spending most of our time doing, which by the way, I think most Israelis oppose, but that's a different discussion, but we're spending most of our time, our efforts on the ground, promoting a campaign that I don't know if you personally agree with, but I think is doing horrible things to my country. And we could go into this discussion, it could be a back and forth, and it's true, I don't represent thousands and thousands of Israeli soldiers. But there was a survey after Cast led, that was done at Tel Aviv University, where after the operation we published testimonials of the operation. And there was a survey that was passed between Israelis, not what you think of breaking the silence, not if you love them or if you think they're good people, but you believe their testimonies. And 60% of Israelis believe the testimonies. So if this is the reality, let's not talk about, well, you don't actually represent anyone, but let's talk about the fact that this is something that's happening, and we can think together about how to change it. Ari, if I was a prime minister, and I will probably not be already, I think that the question of Israeli security is something that, of course, as a prime minister, is something that we have to think about. I think it's also a responsibility of anyone talking about this reality. I don't think that we can, say, there's no security threats and just, la-di-da. Definitely not, right? But I think that when you look at how we have come into this reality, and everyone, the occupation or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is something we Israelis eat and drink in the morning with our coffee, right? We're in this discussion. No one can really ignore it in our society, and I think this isn't something that is new. And I think in that sense, and I'll quote again or quote from the gatekeepers, which Avraham Shalom, if I'm not mistaken, talks about the fact that Israel is working with tactics, with no strategy. And in that sense, we're reacting to a reality, right? I think, and I don't know if you consider yourselves as Zionists, I don't know if you consider how you consider yourself, but if you look back at the history of the Zionist movement, the whole idea was, wait, let's see what is out there and try to change a reality, right? And in that sense, I believe in my right to self-determination. But I also believe Palestinians have the right to self-determination. Let's think about that. And when we'll manage to, if that's the end game, if that's the goal, I do believe, and maybe I'm naive, that Palestinians hate us not only because we're Jewish. And if we think that's the case, and they just hate us because we're Jewish, then, there's nothing we can do. Not education, and not extra curriculum and whatnot. But I believe in people, and I believe that there's a system. And I saw my friends changing in the system, right? And I'm sure other people can also change in the system.
You didn't answer the question. I mean, we're understand all that.
What did you do? I mean, you talk a lot, but you didn't have the accountability.
Yes, but Ari, when you're asking a provocative question, which is okay,
Provocative.
it's okay, it's legitimate, right? But if you want a straightforward answer, I'm not going to give it to you because it's not a straightforward situation. Of course, there's complexity, but in this complexity, what I would hope, and this is part of the reason that this discussion is so fired up, because there's a gap today between our society and the rest of the world. And this gap is there because the rest of the world sees us, and we see ourselves as well, as a Western democracy. And if we're a Western democracy, there's some values we have to live up to. And if there's values we have to live up to, that's something I want to do. We cannot continue to do that when we control people. If your only solution for stopping suicide bombing is an unlasting control over millions of people, you're a minority voice in Israel. Most Israelis want to change. They don't know how to do it, but most Israelis want to change. Some of them want a one-state, or some of them want a two-state. But in that sense, you're a minority. So, Laura, remind me of a question because I can't understand my handwriting.
Sure. The question was that you...
Who's relevant for change?
Yes.
We focus, Break the Silence focuses first and foremost in the Israeli society. 60% of our work is in the Israeli society. That's who we're trying to influence first and foremost. And we're looking for groups who are relevant as well to this reality. For example, one of them, which is very relevant, is the Jewish American community in the United States. Very relevant, right? So we're here on speaking tours, and I was in Hillel houses, and I was in synagogues, and I'm meeting with heads of different communities and religious schools here in New York, and I'm what we'd call professional Jews, right? People who work in the communities in different positions. And we're trying to get this information out because it's also relevant for them. How many times a year do I come here? Maybe once a year if we have the funding. We spend most of our efforts in Israel, with the Israeli society, trying to influence our society with any tools we have. And we'll take people to the ground, we'll have lectures, we'll have talks, we'll have exhibitions, we'll meet with opinion makers, we'll try to publish our stories. What we could hope to do in that sense is make sure that this discussion is always there. Because where we are now, it's either you're against it or you're with it. People not talking about it are allowing this to continue. People saying, let's not talk about the occupation, let's talk about cherry tomatoes and disc on keys, and that Israel is a startup nation, are actually helping the situation to continue. Because there are good things about Israel. That's why I want to stay there. I love my country. Right? But if I'm thinking about Israel, or if I'm thinking about anyone who is close to me, a family member, a brother, if my younger brother who's 17 will do something extremely stupid, and I'll just stand there and say, well, I don't want to criticize him, I'm a bad brother. And I see this reality, which we have put in ourselves into throughout the years. Right? And there were ways out along the way. And I'm not saying there's no responsibility on other sides, but we are controlling this reality. And in that sense, I was an Israeli soldier. I was born and raised in Israel. I pay my taxes to the Israeli society. And that's where my responsibility is to change. And I don't know if we can say that we are extremely successful, because what our goal is to which is very clear, is to end occupation. But we, there are changes that we could see on the ground, but are changing because of our discussions. Maybe later I could talk to them about them if you'd be interested. So let's take a few. How are we doing with time?
We've got about 15 more minutes.
Cool. So yeah.
My name is Matan. I have a question for you. You just said about your brother. If you saw your brother doing something stupid, you would right away go and you would probably criticize him. I was wondering, the book consists of testimonies given by soldiers. I'm not familiar with the book. Unfortunately, I think it's phenomenal to write a book like this one. But what kind of aggravates me is the descriptions that you gave in the book. They refer to soldiers who actually went and stole things, acts of vandalism or whatever it is. Where are the commanders in that situation? And I asked that because I served for a couple of years, for 8 years, and I think that it took me a long time to understand what it means to be in charge of people, especially when these people sometimes, like myself, I was not mature enough to understand at first that I'm actually dealing with other souls, and it's important to be very considerate of them. And I was wondering if you actually found these commanders after these descriptions that you had, and actually, I'm not saying held them accountable for the vandalism that their soldiers did, but do you have testimonies of commanders? And if you don't, are you thinking about writing a new book of testimonies written by commanders who were, what's the word in English? Who witnessed these acts and didn't do anything?
I'll answer you more afterwards, but we have dozens and dozens of officers, some of them in very high positions as well. I mean, and not high generals, but 6, 7 years into the army, 7 Malay. I'll answer. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Janine, and while we're sharing our credentials, my family lives in Nablus in the occupied West Bank, so if anybody wants to know what it's like to be a Palestinian living in the West Bank, I encourage you to talk to me or to actually find out online, because there are two sides to the story. So my question to you is, every Israeli citizen has to go into the army or the border patrols or something like that, so I find it hard to believe that they don't know what's happening. But rather it's that they don't care because they think that this is all limiting security, this is something that's necessary to keep us safe. So my question to you is, what do you say when you go to other Israelis and talk to them about this?
Thank you. What's your name? David.
I lived in Israel for several years, and I have to say that I share what Ari said before about this, like the story you told, that probably true because I've heard very stories similar to that. But I think that there is a whole lot of other stuff that you didn't mention. You said that this is not just a matter of like rotten apples, of a few stories, of a few instances, and you seem to be quite proud of the 800 testimonies and 60 soldiers that went all together to testify to breaking the silence. In the Israeli army, there are 176,000 soldiers serving and almost 500,000 in reserves.
How many? 170?
176,000 approximately.
I always get that. People always ask me, and I don't know.
Okay, so compared to this number, I mean, the kind of numbers that you're bringing to the table are like quite few. And by the way, another correction to what you said before, I'm here on the website of BBC News. The number of Palestinians killed between 2000 and 2005 were 3,133.
Just a small remark before you answer, Avner. It's important to mention that David, correct me if I'm wrong, you didn't serve in the army. You came to Israel as a student.
Yes.
So I think it's just.
Is that a shame?
No, nothing.
No,
just
that
to
something to
put it out there.
Sergeant in the military, so what?
True, just to put it out there. I think it's important to give context, as he said, so that's the context
Perfect.
that I
It's
want
important to let people talk.
It's true, and
It's also-
giving it.
Okay, please go ahead and finish your comment. Let's keep the comments relatively brief, because I think a lot of people have.
So, yeah, I'll get to the question. Again, related to what Ari said before, I think you missed a lot of stuff in the big picture. How come you did not mention for even once the word terror or terrorism?
I think I did, but
Okay.
let's take one last question.
You should sit there.
My son, former Israeli soldier. No, sorry. I would like to add context. My question is, can I read a testimony? Maybe to add to your book.
Sure. Can we do it afterwards? Do you want to ask a question first?
That is my question. Can I
So let's leave it for the end, if that's okay?
And you're
Okay.
studying in
Um,
Colombia. You have
or maybe if you'll you can continue the conversation afterwards. Yeah.
Eric? Yeah, thanks.
I actually have a question.
Okay, wait, I need to. So we'll do two more. Yeah.
American, okay. Who's American? Real American.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, you're right. You know what? Let's hear some women. But we heard from Janine, she had a great question I want to answer. So I'll get back to you, I promise, okay? Yes.
Mariana, I have a much cooler question, which, we're in a university, you've written a book. I'd like to know about the book. I mean, the book is signed by Breaking the Silence. So I want to know about the process of writing it. Who's the we? I mean, you talked about your organization. I'd like to know how it's organized. And I want to say, since we're all giving credentials, I went on a tour with Breaking the Silence to Hebron, and it was an amazing experience. I really admire your work. But I admire the fact that you're gathering testimonies, but you're also writing books, and I want to know about that.
Like one last question? Name?
Julia.
Oh, yeah.
Don't forget about me. I'm a New Yorker, I promise.
I also went to the South of Vermont Hills on a tour, and but that's not particularly relevant. What I really want to ask is, you mentioned that that you receive a lot, or you and Breaking Silence receive a lot of criticism for not only speaking to Israelis about this, and perhaps not even only to Jews, but like airing dirty laundry. And like I said, I'm an American Jew, and I was profoundly affected by the tour in the South of Hills, and an event here last year in the law school where we spoke. However, I want to ask is, how do you respond to people who criticize you specifically for speaking not only to Israelis but to a room like this?
Okay. So just Natan. Matan. So like I said, in our testimonies, there are dozens and dozens of officers, and I think one of the things that I talked a lot here. You were in all the lecture, right? We talked a lot about systems. Right? We talked about tools that are used in different scenarios, and in that sense, when we talk about it, I think the important thing to understand is, we're talking about things coming from the highest chain of command. Now, I could have a lecture, which is a possibility, and I chose not to do it, and I usually choose not to do it, to have a whole lecture about the IDF horror show. And there were things that were maybe not easy to hear. I read one testimony about theft, but most of what I was talking about is the system. And in that sense, one of the things I told at the end is when the soldier in Hebron has written in his posts, לשבש את חיי השגרה של התושבים הפלסטינים, to disrupt the day-to-day life of the Palestinian population, he didn't write it with a pen. It's not even an officer. It comes from very high up. There's a very interesting book written by Shaul Arieli, who was a very high-ranking officer, one of the person that planned the separation barrier, and Michael Sfard is a human rights attorney, and it's called Choma Mechdal, which is funny to Israelis. I can't even start explaining it in English, but it's basically a book about the separation barrier. And one of the interesting stories he gives in the book is Ariel Sharon, was an Israeli prime minister, driving up from Jerusalem during the beginning, right? I mean, the Second Intifada started September 2000, but it was a while till people realized what this is the Intifada, and by the way, I recommend to see a movie called A Million Bullets in October, which I think is very interesting. But with him, he flew up in a helicopter to Khatmar Shomron, to the regional battalion of Shomron, of Samaria. And he gets there, and the first thing he says when he gets to the Brigadier General's office, and Ariel Sharon was a pretty skinny guy, was a pretty big guy, and he comes and he knocks on the table and he says, "Why are there Palestinian cars driving on Route 60? Route 60 is the route that crosses the West Bank from north to south." And brigadier officer says, oh, Mr. Sharon, give me the orders and we'll make it happen. You know, we can't just do it because... And Ariel Sharon says, what do you mean? Have your soldiers forgotten how to rip tires? How to take spark plugs? Now, the first exhibition of Breaking the Silence, there was a whole wall full of car keys. Right? There was one unit in one place at one time. We confiscated car keys, confiscated IDs, and it comes up over and over. When you talk about this reality, which by the way, and this is where we're coming and saying, you know, when we're expecting the Israeli army to continue this reality, because that's the political analogy, then this is what it looks like. You can't control people in a different way. I think you'll always have these realities of what is, you know, theft and humiliation, beating up. But I think much more interesting and much more destructive to the Palestinian population is not that the Palestinian was slapped on his face. It stings for a while and then it passes, right? And it's humiliating, but then it passes. What's much more destructive is 1,800 stores that are closing down in the heart of Hebron. That we're talking about 72% unemployment in the biggest Palestinian city in the West Bank. That women in their 5th month of pregnancy are denied access to an ambulance. These are not decisions of 18, 19-year-olds. This has been going on since 2000. Everyone knows about it. Documentaries, movies, videos. It's not news even in Israel anymore. And it's true that the only thing that manages to break our surface inside our society, which I'm spending so much time trying to get this information out there, we're trying so much time. Every so often there's an incident of, that man, like Eden Abaljil, was a border police soldier that took pictures with a Palestinian who was handcuffed, and she posted on Facebook, wrote, "The best time of my life." Now we said, oh my God, this is horrible, ta-ta-ta, and quickly the discussion became, it's Eden Abaljil. She's the problem. She's the issue. We published 30 pictures, are exactly the same. Taking pictures next to dead bodies, taking pictures, some people with pretty high-ranking officers as well. So in that sense, to think that it's only about the markers that you stole, right? Or, doing something, it's bigger than that. It's bigger than that because we're talking about a system that controls people by force. You'll always have that. Janine. It's one of the questions we get a lot, and I'm happy you asked it, because I think one of the biggest misconceptions about the Israeli society is everyone goes, everyone knows, right? But look at the numbers today, right? We're talking about between 60% of girls, women, and 40% of men don't join the army already today. Ultra-Orthodox Jews, Palestinian Israelis, religious girls in the religious Zionist community. They do community service, they don't join the army. People that get off for health reasons, and people that get off for conscientious objectors, which is a very small, minor amount of the people. But today, already, close to 50% of Israelis don't even serve. But when we think about who serves in the army, let's think about armies around the world. How many of the American army, how many soldiers of the American army are today in Iraq and Afghanistan? Most are not on the ground. Only 9 to 10% of Israeli soldiers serve in the West Bank. Because it's an army and there's other things to do. And there's a north border and a south border, and there's people in desk jobs, and there's people in other positions, right? And there's people in the Navy who sometimes could not even go close to areas that are relevant to what we're talking about. So in that sense, I think it is fair to say that most people do not know what is happening on the ground, but everyone thinks they know. Now, my dad served, he was a great guy and I love him, served as a paratrooper in '73, did his reserve duty till end of the 80s and beginning of the 90s, right? So last time he was there was a different reality, totally different reality. I mean, most of his reserve duty was in Lebanon. And I remember when I came to my dad and told him, work for Breaking the Silence, and it wasn't an easy thing for them originally. It wasn't easy for them to accept that, especially you're criticizing, why are you talking against, and I remember that in one of the Shabbat dinners, family dinner table, my wife, I think she was already my wife back then, maybe my girlfriend back then, said, talk with your dad about it. And I talk with them. First from external, I talk about testimonies, I talk about stories, and then I start telling my stories. And when I start talking about my stories, he turns around basically and says, you didn't do this. Because how difficult is it to see your child, to see your friend, your son, your brother do horrible things, right? And in that sense, it's an extremely difficult thing, what we're doing. We think it's important. We're picking up a mirror to the Israeli society. And it's an ugly picture. It's an ugly reflection. And when you have a very ugly face, eventually, you'll stop looking in the mirror. You'll take down every mirror in the house. What we can hope to do is put it there, is make sure there's a discussion, is make sure people know that this is going on now when we're sitting here. This is going on now when people are living their lives. And in that sense, we could hope to do that. And I think, by the way, since the Second Intifada, for reasons I can understand, we're talking about, David, just to correct what I said, since the end of the Second Intifada, there were 6,000 Palestinians killed and 1,000 Israelis. So we're talking about this time. This has been a trauma, both for Israelis and for Palestinians. This is a trauma. And the decision to cut off, right, this decision to cut off is something that is understandable. But we don't have the privilege to do that. Right? It's in our benefit to say, no, let's talk about this. Let's change this. But we can change it before we really know this is happening. We bring thousands of Israelis. And it's just amazing how surprised they are when they come to Hebron. Because even Israelis who see themselves on the left don't want to go to Hebron. It's not a fun place to be. It leaves you with a difficult feeling in your stomach. This knot takes days to unravel.
We're just about out of time, so I know Mariana had a good question.
So Mariana, how is Breaking the Silence organized? So we really started out as the epitome of the grassroots, just trying to, the beginning, the 60 guys put together their money from the army service and bought a scooter. And Yehuda Utuki went around in the scooter from house to house and wrote things down in a notebook. But we have evolved as an organization. What we have today, a department that's in charge of gathering testimonies. There's 2 people in the department. And we do a lot of work and a lot of, between the both of them, they meet close to 120 soldiers a year. That's our capacity. It's true, David, that there are many more soldiers serving. That's our capacity to get to. And it's also fair to say, most people, for many different reasons, some don't agree with us politically, some want to put it behind them, some think that it is irrelevant, don't come and give their testimony. But that's what we try to do, and we try to be as relevant as possible to what is happening. We just actually decided recently that we'll start gathering testimonies, not from soldiers who served since 2000, but soldiers who served since 2005. Because we try to keep the things updated, and there's things to talk about. The reality is definitely there. I served after the Second Intifada, right? The Second Intifada ended 2004, 2005. I served till the end of 2007, right? And there's testimonies here till 2010, and we just revealed a testimonial book in the past year. So in that sense, this reality is not going to end. It will change. And you read the different testimonies, they look different, because it was a different time. And that's, of course, something we're aware of. But this reality of control will always bring up new testimonies. There's no way around it. Any other organizational questions in that sense?
How you wrote the book, how you co-wrote the book, or who wrote it?
So there are, so I'm glad to have one of my testimonies in here, but I wasn't one of the editors. There's a group of about 4 guys that all were co-founders of the organization that came together and started reading through the testimonies. The interesting thing, we talked about this in our discussion before, that these terms, these 4 pillars, are terms that most Israeli soldiers know. I mean, these are not new. I mean, you get orders in the bases. You have to prevent terror, mesakel facha, right? Pilut chablanit oyenet. You have to separate, right? This is practical things that you actually do on the ground. you have to maintain the fabric of life, right? So in that sense, these are all things that we knew, right? So we took them from this toolbox and tried to translate them in that sense. So that was the easy part, finding and connecting the dots and making sure that the testimony is all there. That was a little bit more difficult. Writing in each chapter, we have this. Like I said, the first time we did analysis, each chapter has an explanation about it. So we actually have a whole description about what moved us to do this book, but also each chapter on its own explains what we mean, basically what I tried to explain. So the book is pretty thick, but it's a pretty easy read. Not a fun one, but a pretty easy read. You can actually read all the hakdamot, all the prefixes of the chapters pretty quickly. And then the testimonials, you know, if you get the book, don't read too many of them, but they'll just give you a better understanding of what it is we're talking about. Julia, right. Again, I would remind me of your question.
So basically, how do you respond to criticism for talking to American audiences?
So again, I think, you know, like I said, the question is, who has the right to know, right? If 50% of Israelis today don't serve already, right? There's a Haredi Jew, ultra-Orthodox Jew who lives in Mashal and doesn't serve in the army, right? Does he have more right to know than, you know, I don't know, maybe someone in your family that donates 10,000 shekels a year to the IDF, right? And that's an interesting discussion of the limits of democracy, right? At the end of the day, we spend most of our energy in Israel. But one of the things we realize that if we want to be relevant to change a political reality, not only keep our silence, we have to get this information out there to whoever is willing to hear. And in that sense, the people who are trying to keep the status quo are doing exactly the same. I mean, look at different lobby groups here in the US, look at different organizations on campus. I mean, in that sense, they're trying to maintain the status quo that is so dangerous for us. I think there's also something to be said about today, in our world. If I can sign a petition against dolphin huntings in Japan, I think you as American citizens, which are connected to this reality. I mean, I walked around with a gun that said, "Colt, property of the USA government," for 3 years. Right? So I want the support to continue, but one of the things I would expect is, you know, write us the checks if you want, why not, but also ask questions. Right? If you want, if we share these values, and that's what connects us. We have similar values, and there's also things that we're doing that do not live up to your values, and let's have a discussion about that. And I'll say something, Julia, about the Jewish community, which I think is very relevant, and it's something that people I work with very closely throughout my year. That's most of the groups I meet in Israel. And I just met with a friend before I left, American Jew, who I think gave me this amazing line, which I think is just so true. There's a fear in progressive Jewish communities inside in the States today. Let's not let our kids engage in this reality, because maybe they won't be able to deal with what's happening there. And there were cases of people pushing away. I know people who were involved in different ways. They said, I didn't want anything to do with Israel. And what he told me, which I think was fascinating, and this is where I'm throwing the ball back to you guys, is the reason he was so furious was not because what he saw there was, so crazy and so bad. And he's an intelligent guy. He knows what's happening around the world. There's other conflicts. There's other places. But in that sense, what the strongest thing that he felt was that he was lied to all his life about what Israel is. And in that sense, there's amazing sides in Israel, right? Like every person, individual, or group or body, but there's also ugly sides. And if we truly want to be supporters of this, if we truly want to show a real love for this place, then we cannot disregard these ugly parts. And I think the responsibility of, for sure, diaspora Jews, but I think worldwide. I mean, this is, for many years now, not only an internal Israeli conflict. People say you're airing our dirty laundry. There's millions of Palestinians there. they're not relevant? How can this be my dirty laundry? There's millions of people there. But there's so much money, effort, time spent in this from the international community, then what I would hope that there will be a better understanding of what is happening there. Let that discussion start there. We can be very helpful in helping those conversations start. I'm not here the entire year. I'm going back in a week and a half back home and continuing our work in Israel. We can hope that you guys, you, Julia, could actually take this information and start this discussion. And take it head on. Do it with Ari and with Amit and with David and Natan, and do it, right? Because it's an important discussion. But we have to recognize that this is part of the reality. And I'll just end with that, because I'm sure we're out of time.
Just one more. New Yorker.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, no, my question has, thank you for your time this evening, and thanks for everybody for sticking around. My question has to do with the Israeli domestic political environment, that on an electoral level, Israeli politics has really become atomized. And given the opinions even in this room, dare I say that I'm not wrong about that. My question is, how does the peace process and how do informal efforts like yours overcome that political atomization? Or do you have to overcome it? Is there a way to work within that? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I don't know if I have a very good answer, but I think one of the problems that we have in our society, that I would say in the camp in Israel that is trying to change this reality, is that we're content with trying to do whatever we can to push the people in the room to our direction. Right? If it's now Netanyahu or now Livni, we'll try to push them and scream as loud as we can in their ear. Do this and that. The problem is, and this is something that I don't know why this is happening, but that we think that they're enough. If you look at Netanyahu's views, if you look at people in his coalition, Avner Gvaryahu, who used to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs, said in the UN 2 years ago, we have to stop talking about conflict resolution and start talking about conflict management. Right? So, in that sense, if you hear the voices from the coalition today, he's moderate. There's people calling their, so in that sense, what I think we can try to do is not scream the loudest in someone's ear when, first of all, we know they're deaf in the right ear, and in the other ear there's hundreds of people screaming in the other ear. We have to start thinking about changing the people in the room. But the premise is, and again, it's not that the Labour Party didn't help build the settlements as well. Let's put that. But what we can try to do is build a community inside Israel as big as possible that will say we have to first and foremost end this. And by the way, I don't think this is something that will only end by Israelis. They're our focus group. They're who we're trying to push the most. But it's of course relevant to the Palestinians and how they'll play their cards. This is of course relevant to the United States. This is of course relevant to Europe, right? So in that sense, we can hope to be part of a group, part of a voice, together with partners, with friends, with allies that are also seeking a change in this reality to do it together. I'll just end with how you can help us. First thing you can all do, I know some of you are students and buying a book isn't always so easy. What you can all do is go on our website and like us on Facebook, like us on our website, follow us on Twitter, share this event with other people. It's extremely important to get the word out there. On our website, after you like us on Facebook, go on our website, under media, organization media, there's a 30-minute video about Hebron. Watch it. It's very good. Think of 5 people that will hate it. Send it to them. Think of 5 people that will find it very interesting. Send it to them. Right? We can hope to start this discussion, and you can help us do that. If you would be interested in purchasing a copy of the book, they're $15 for students. They're $20 if you're not. It could extremely help us, especially me. I won't have to carry them to Pittsburgh tomorrow. We're doing this entire tour on donations. If you could help us out a little bit, that will always be helpful. Thank you so much for your time. I'm here to continue the discussion.